Harry William adjusted his worn coat, the weight of the fabric a subtle comfort against the cold air outside. His cane, its once polish but now dulled by years of use, tapped softly against the tiled floor as he entered the cafe. The contrast between his modest presence and the pristine, high-end establishment was immediately apparent. Conversations faltered for a moment. Eyes drifted toward him, some lingering longer than others. Harry wasn't a stranger to such reactions, but they stung nonetheless. He chose a seat near the window, a corner that felt private despite the room's open layout. As he eased himself into the chair, he glanced at the other patrons. A man in a navy suit flicked a disapproving look over his newspaper, his lips pressed in a thin line. Across the room, a woman whispered to her companion, her eyes darting toward Harry's frayed coat and worn shoes. Harry ignored them. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here for Robert. The tablecloth felt smooth under his rough hands, a stark contrast to the calluses etched by years of hard work. He adjusted his cane, placing it carefully against the edge of the table, and checked his watch, a simple timepiece with a cracked face, yet still reliable. Robert was late. Not unusual, considering his son's demanding job, but Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something about today was different. His gaze wandered to the cafe's decor, clean lines, sleek furniture, and glass panels that let in too much light. This wasn't the kind of place Harry frequented. It had been Robert's suggestion, perhaps to make him feel special. Harry smiled faintly at the thought. Despite their differences, Robert always tried in his own way to bridge the gap. The sound of heavy boots interrupted his thoughts. Two men in uniform entered, their presence impossible to ignore. George, a broad-shouldered officer with a perpetually stern expression, scanned the room like a hawk. Behind him was Gilbert, wiry and sharp-featured, his eyes darting from table to table with a calculating gaze. Harry lowered his eyes, pretending to study the menu card. His fingers tightened around it slightly, the familiar unease creeping into his chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a deep awareness of how quickly things could go wrong in moments like this. The officers lingered at the counter, exchanging quiet words with the barista. George's gaze swept across the room again, landing squarely on Harry. His expression shifted, suspicion hardening his features. He leaned toward Gilbert, speaking in a tone low enough to blend with the hum of the cafe, but loud enough to reach Harry's ears. "See that guy over there?" George muttered, tilting his head in Harry's direction. "Doesn't exactly fit the scene, does he?" Gilbert smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, what's he doing here?" Their quiet conversation ended with a shared nod, and they began moving toward Harry. He felt their approach before he saw them, his senses attuned to the tension in their steps. Taking a steadying breath, he reminded himself that he had every right to be here. He was a paying customer, just like everyone else. "Excuse me, sir," George said as they reached his table, his voice firm but laced with unspoken judgment. "Can we have a word?" Harry looked up slowly, meeting George's gaze. "Of course," he said evenly, his tone calm despite the knot forming in his stomach. "Is something wrong?" George folded his arms, looming over Harry. "We've had some reports about suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Harry straightened in his chair, his dark eyes steady as he replied, "I'm waiting for my son. We plan to meet here." Gilbert snorted, his smirk widening. "Your son, huh? And who might that be?" "Robert William," Harry said without hesitation. He's with the precinct. The mention of Robert's name gave the officers a moment's pause, but the suspicion in their expressions didn't waver. George raised an eyebrow. Got any ID to back that up? Without a word, Harry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. Among the faded cards was his veteran's ID, a testament to the years he'd spent serving his country. He handed it to George, who scrutinized it with exaggerated care. Gilbert leaned in, peering over his partner's shoulder. "Looks fake to me," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "What do you think?" Harry's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That card is real. I earned it." George returned the card, his expression unreadable. "Just sit tight," he said curtly. "We'll be keeping an eye on you." As they walked away, Harry exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. Around him, the cafe remained painfully indifferent. A man glanced his way, then quickly returned to his coffee. A couple whispered to each other, avoiding his gaze. Harry's chest felt heavy, but he refused to let the weight crush him. He glanced at the door, silently willing Robert to arrive soon. He would not let this moment define him. Harry kept his gaze fixed on the table, fingers brushing the worn surface of his cane. The officers hadn't gone far. George and Gilbert were standing by the counter, exchanging low words. Harry couldn't hear them, but their posture, how their eyes flicked toward him occasionally, said more than enough. The cafe held its breath, the tension palpable. Patrons tried to ignore what was happening, but Harry could feel the curiosity in the air. The occasional side glance, the nervous shifting of feet. It painted a picture he knew all too well. He adjusted his watch for the third time, though it hadn't moved. "Where's Robert?" The minutes seemed to stretch, the absence of his son growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, George straightened and began walking toward Harry's table again, Gilbert following close behind. The sharp sound of their boots against the floor cut through the room, sending a ripple of discomfort through the crowd. "Let's try this again," George said as he reached Harry's table, his voice sharper this time. He leaned slightly over Harry, casting a shadow over his seated form. "You said you're waiting for your son, but you've got nothing else to show us besides that card." Harry lifted his gaze, meeting George's eyes with calm resolve. "That card isn't just something, officer. It's proof of my service to this country. Isn't that enough?" Gilbert snorted, crossing his arms. "Service to the country, huh? Sure doesn't look like it." He gestured dismissively at Harry's coat, the frayed sleeves barely hanging on. "You expect us to believe you're some kind of war hero?" The insult stung more than Harry anticipated, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his posture, slow and deliberate. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, voice steady. "I've already done that in ways you wouldn't understand." George's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Watch your tone," he warned, voice dropping a notch. "You don't want to make this harder on yourself." Before Harry could respond, Gilbert stepped forward and picked up his cane, examining it like it was a relic. He spun it between his hands, inspecting every detail before turning it over. "Nice cane," Gilbert said, his voice thick with mockery. "Looks like it's seen better days. Just like you." Harry's hand twitched instinctively, but he kept himself in check. "Put it down," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice level despite the anger that threatened to rise. "Or what?" Gilbert smirked, holding the cane just out of Harry's reach. He exchanged a look with George, who nodded almost imperceptibly. With an exaggerated motion, Gilbert slammed the cane against the floor. The sound of cracking was like a gunshot in the room. Gasps erupted from the nearby tables, and the cafe seemed to freeze. A small piece of Harry's cane splintered and fell to the ground, the wood laying there like a broken promise. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Harry's mind flooded with images, his younger self, carving that cane from a sturdy branch on the edge of a foreign field, the miles it had traveled with him since then. It wasn't just a cane. It was a piece of his history. The murmurs in the cafe grew louder, but no one moved. Most of the patrons looked away, pretending not to notice. A few of them pulled out their phones, their cameras aimed discreetly, capturing the moment like it was some kind of spectacle. Harry leaned forward slightly, his voice low but steady. "That cane meant something to me," he said, his words deliberate. "Just like this place means something to everyone sitting here. But none of you," he looked around, meeting the eyes of various patrons, "have the courage to speak up when something's wrong." George let out an exasperated sigh, clearly losing patience. "Enough of the speeches, old man. You're making a scene." Harry met his gaze, unflinching. "No, officer. You're the one making a scene, and you're the one who's going to regret it." The room was electric now, the air thick with anticipation. Harry wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was standing up for something larger, for every forgotten man like him. And though the anger churned inside him, he refused to let it break his calm. Before the officers could retort, Harry's eyes landed on something. Half hidden beneath the menu, a small card. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he recognized it immediately. It was Robert's card, the commissioner's card. His heart skipped a beat, and with it, a faint spark of hope flickered. He studied the card for a moment before slipping it into his pocket, trying to ignore the flurry of emotions it brought. Maybe, just maybe, his son would arrive in time to stop this before it escalated any further. The air in the cafe was tense, every breath taken with caution as Harry sat silently, the remnants of his shattered cane scattered at his feet. The clatter of the broken wood was still fresh in his mind, echoing in the pit of his stomach. He had fought in wars where death came with a single shot, yet nothing had ever hit him like that. As he sat there, a deep calm washed over him. He had fought battles on foreign soil, faced challenges that demanded more than physical strength, but nothing tested him like the cruelty of these men. He could feel the heat of their eyes on him, the weight of their suspicion. Still, he remained composed. He had learned long ago that the greatest weapon was the power of restraint. George's voice broke the silence, harsh and commanding. "You're really pushing your luck now," he sneered, stepping closer. "You could have just kept quiet, gone on your merry way. But no. Now you're trying to make a scene." Harry could feel the blood rising in his veins, but he kept his cool. He had nothing to prove. His service had already spoken for him. Even if these men didn't know it yet, his hand reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the hard edges of his son's card. For a fleeting moment, he thought about calling Robert now, but something inside him held back. Robert had enough to deal with. This was Harry's battle. Besides, Harry had fought for this country. He had earned his dignity long, before these officers even put on their badges. "You don't have the right to treat me like this," Harry said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. He looked at George and then at Gilbert, who was now leaning casually against the counter, arms folded across his chest. Gilbert let out a low chuckle. "Oh, I think you'll find we have all the rights we need, old man. You're just too proud for your own good." Harry stood slowly, the absence of his cane making him feel unbalanced for just a moment. But he didn't flinch. He stood tall, staring at George, his eyes unwavering. "I don't need a cane to stand up for myself," he said, his voice even but firm. A couple of patrons exchanged nervous glances. One woman, sitting near the counter, slowly put down her coffee cup, her eyes darting between the officers and Harry. George took a step forward, his voice lowering to a threatening tone. "You don't understand, do you? You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you're not going anywhere until we say so." But Harry was done with words. He had faced worse than this. As the officers moved in, he stood his ground, breathing deeply. He was no stranger to authority figures who thought they could break him. This wasn't the first time he'd been looked down upon. He'd had to fight for his life before. This was no different. With sudden decisiveness, George grabbed Harry's arm, pulling it toward him as if trying to force him into submission. The force of the grip was unexpected, but Harry didn't react with the panic they likely anticipated. Instead, he squared his shoulders and stood his ground. "I said, I'm not going anywhere," Harry repeated, his voice unwavering. "Not until you show some respect." Gilbert stepped forward, grinning like a man who thought he had everything under control. "Respect? You think respect is what you're going to get out of us? You've got the wrong idea, pal." Harry's pulse quickened, but he took another deep breath, refusing to let his emotions take control. He couldn't afford to lose his temper, not now. A few moments passed, the silence growing heavier with every second. Harry could feel the weight of all the eyes in the cafe on him. Some patrons seemed uncomfortable, others watched with rapt attention, but no one intervened. He knew why. They were afraid of speaking up, afraid of challenging authority. Finally, as the officers began to push further, Harry's gaze flickered to the card in his pocket again. He took a slow step back, eyes narrowing slightly as the realization hit him with a force he hadn't expected. Robert was not just a son. He was a man with power. He pulled the card from his pocket, holding it between his fingers, just enough for the officers to see. Without a word, he slid it across the table toward George. "I think you'll want to take a look at this." George's face faltered for a moment, his cocky smirk faltering as his gaze fell to the card. "What's this?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "It's my son's card," Harry said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "He's the commissioner here in this city. So before you decide to make another mistake, you might want to think about what you're doing." Gilbert looked at the card, his expression now mixed with confusion and uncertainty. For the first time, Harry saw a hint of doubt in their eyes. It was like a switch had been flipped. George's grip on Harry's arm loosened just enough for him to pull back slightly. The sudden realization that Harry wasn't just another old man caught them off guard. The room held its collective breath. "Commissioner's son," George muttered under his breath. His voice had dropped a few octaves, no longer carrying the same edge it had before. "You should have said that from the start." Harry didn't move. He let them stew in the quiet, watching the panic creep into their expressions. But before George could say anything more, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Robert stepped into the cafe, his voice calm but unmistakably authoritative. The moment his figure appeared in the doorway, everything shifted. The officers froze. The cafe had gone eerily quiet at the sound of Robert's voice. The usual murmur of conversation had fallen silent, leaving behind only the soft clink of cups and the low hum of the fluorescent lights above. Harry didn't look up immediately, but he could feel the weight of his son's presence. Robert had always carried himself with a quiet authority, one that Harry had admired but never truly understood. Until now, the officers, once so confident and brash, stood frozen in place. Their hands hung awkwardly by their sides, unsure of their next move. George glanced over at Gilbert, who quickly diverted his gaze, now uncomfortably shifting from foot to foot. The realization of who Harry's son was had hit them hard, and the pride that had made them so bold moments ago was now replaced by uncertainty and fear. Robert walked over to Harry without hesitation. His eyes flicked briefly to the officers, taking in their flustered expressions before settling on his father. "Is everything all right, Dad?" he asked, his voice smooth, the way it always was when he was in control of a situation. Harry met his son's gaze, his face unreadable, though his heart swelled with pride at the man Robert had become. "I'm fine, son. Just having a little chat with these fine officers," he replied, his voice steady despite the situation. George and Gilbert both stiffened at Robert's arrival. They clearly hadn't expected him, certainly not so soon, but they should have known. In a city like this, someone like Robert didn't just stay behind closed doors. He was everywhere, in ways most people could only imagine. Robert's gaze shifted to the card on the table, now partially crumpled from being handled. He picked it up with care, reading it for a brief moment before looking back up at the two officers. "I trust you've been treating my father with respect." His tone was calm but unmistakably firm, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. George opened his mouth as though to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Robert didn't let him speak. "I don't want to hear your excuses, George," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "You've been abusing your authority. My father served this country with honor, and you treated him like a criminal." The words hit like a slap, and for a brief moment, the officers faltered. They could feel the shift in the room, the air thick with the weight of the accusation. Gilbert shifted uncomfortably on his feet, and George's jaw clenched, a sign of the pride that was still fighting against the realization that they were in the wrong. Robert stepped closer, never taking his eyes off the officers. "I'm going to make this very clear. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Not by me. Not by anyone in this city. You will answer for this. I'll see to it personally." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was thick, almost palpable, as if the entire cafe had held its breath waiting for something to happen. Finally, George spoke, his voice tight and strained. "You don't understand, son. We were just—" "Don't call me son," Robert interrupted, his words cutting through George's defenses like a knife. "I don't care about your excuses. What I care about is making sure you don't make another mistake like this again." The words hung in the air, and Harry couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude towards his son. Robert wasn't just a man of power. He was a man of integrity, and in that moment, he was showing it in full force. Harry had always known his son had the strength to stand up for what was right. But now he could see the fire in Robert's eyes, the kind of fire that was never extinguished by injustice. Robert turned to the cafe's patrons, who had been watching the exchange with bated breath. "You all saw what happened here. You saw the way my father was treated. If you're standing by and doing nothing, then you're part of the problem." The room remained silent. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably, while others seemed to brace themselves for a response. Harry noticed a couple of people glance at him, their faces softening, some even nodding subtly in agreement. The moment was shifting. No longer was it just an old man being pushed around. It was a symbol, a stand for dignity, for respect, for something bigger than just a single incident. "I want both of you to leave," Robert said firmly, his voice brokering no argument. "And if you ever so much as look at my father again with any hint of disrespect, you'll regret it." George and Gilbert didn't move immediately. Their pride was still wounded, their egos bruised by the revelation that they had overstepped, that they had been caught in a lie. But they knew better than to argue now. With a muttered, "Yes, sir," George finally motioned for Gilbert to follow him. The two of them walked quickly toward the door, their shoulders hunched in defeat. As the door swung closed behind them, the cafe seemed to exhale, the tension leaving with them. But the room was far from the same. A strange sense of solidarity had been born in those final moments, and it was palpable in the silence that lingered. Robert turned back to Harry, his face softening. "Are you okay, Dad?" Harry nodded, his gaze steady as he met his son's eyes. "I'm all right, son. You did good." He smiled, the warmth of that simple gesture reaching deep into Robert's heart. He had never been prouder. As George and Gilbert left the cafe, the tension that had once gripped the room began to slowly dissolve. The cafe's patrons, who had been quiet spectators, now began to murmur amongst themselves. Whispers of approval for Robert's actions filled the air, and Harry, though still seated, could feel the shift. The silence in the room was no longer one of discomfort, but one of quiet respect. Robert turned back to Harry, his eyes softened by the weight of the moment. "Dad," he said, his voice low and steady, "you don't have to go through that kind of treatment. Not for anyone. Not here, not anywhere." Harry's fingers brushed the edge of the crumpled card still resting on the table. It had been a subtle reminder of his connection to Robert, but also of something deeper. The old man's eyes softened as he gazed at his son, a sense of pride swelling within him. "I never asked for any special treatment, Robert," Harry replied, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity that had always defined him. "I've fought my battles, and I've lived through enough. But it's not just about me. It's about what we're teaching these people, teaching the world." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Robert understood. The look of defiance in his father's eyes, the calm strength that had carried him through life's hardships, was more than just survival. It was a statement, one that resonated far beyond the walls of this cafe. Before Robert could respond, the murmurings from the other patrons grew louder. It was as though the entire room had been waiting for the moment to pass, and now that it had, they were ready to speak. One of the older men, a regular at the cafe, stood up. His face was weathered by age, his hair a mix of silver and white, but his eyes held a sharpness that belied his years. "I've seen it before," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable conviction. "The way they treat people like you, like me, like all of us who don't fit the mold. It's wrong. It's been wrong for a long time." Several others nodded in agreement. Their eyes now turned to Harry, the one who had been targeted. They saw him not just as an old man in a cafe, but as a symbol of resilience, someone who had borne the weight of injustice and still stood tall. Harry looked at the man who had spoken and nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but full of gratitude. "It's not easy to speak up when you see something wrong, especially when you don't know how it'll be received. But it means something." Robert watched his father as he spoke, the words not just a lesson to the others in the cafe, but to him as well. Harry's strength was not just in the battles he'd fought in the past, but in the way he carried himself now, in how he stood his ground without ever raising his voice. But the cafe wasn't just becoming a space for acknowledgement. The weight of the moment had settled deeply within its walls, and it was clear that it had touched something in those who had witnessed it. Slowly, patrons began to stand, and a few made their way toward Harry's table. One by one, they offered their apologies for the behavior of the officers, though none of them had been directly involved. Some, like the older man, spoke words of solidarity, telling Harry how much they appreciated his calm in the face of adversity. Others, younger and unsure, seemed hesitant but still moved by what had happened. Robert stood back, his arms crossed as he observed the scene. He had spent much of his life in high-profile meetings, dealing with bureaucrats and politicians, but this moment, this was real. The kind of justice that lived in everyday actions, in simple acts of standing up for what was right. As the exchange continued, Harry grew quieter, his pride swelling at the display of respect from the cafe's patrons. The sting of the earlier confrontation with the officers had not disappeared, but it was beginning to fade. What had been taken from him, the sense of dignity that had been so swiftly stripped away, was being restored not by an officer's apology, but by the simple acknowledgement of the people around him. After a few minutes, Robert returned to his father's side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be all right, Dad," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "We'll make sure this never happens again." Harry nodded slowly, the weight of the day finally catching up with him. "I've seen worse, son," he said softly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." The words seemed to resonate with the others in the cafe, as if they too understood that the fight for dignity wasn't over, even in moments of progress. As Harry and Robert stood up to leave, the patrons continued to watch them, but it was different now. They weren't just two men walking out of the cafe. They were a father and son, standing side by side, a symbol of resilience and justice. Before they reached the door, the older man who had spoken earlier called out to Harry, "You've earned my respect, sir. Thank you for standing tall." Robert gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his gaze steady. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but carrying a deep weight of meaning. "My father's been standing tall his whole life." And with that, Harry and Robert walked out of the cafe, leaving behind a room full of people who had witnessed something rare, a quiet act of dignity that had shifted the course of the day and perhaps of something greater. As Harry and Robert walked down the cobbled streets, the atmosphere around them seemed to breathe a little easier. The tension from earlier was no longer palpable, replaced by a strange sense of relief. The sound of their footsteps was steady, though Harry could feel the weight of the day still lingering in his bones. "Are you all right?" Robert asked, glancing at his father as they made their way toward the car parked a little further down the street. Harry nodded, but the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed him. "I will be," he said softly. It's not the first time, Robert. But I guess I thought, in places like that, there was something different. Robert glanced at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. I know, Dad. I know. But it's not just about places. It's about the people in them. Harry chuckled quietly, a soft sound that barely rose above the hum of the street. Maybe so, he said, but sometimes it feels like the people in those places forget what it's like for someone like me to walk in. They see an old man with a cane, and they don't see the years behind him, the battles he fought, the things he's lost. They reached the car, and Robert opened the door for his father, his hand hovering protectively over his shoulder for a brief moment. Harry climbed in with a sigh, settling back against the seat, and Robert took his place behind the wheel. The engine hummed to life, and they began the short drive back to Robert's office. The ride was mostly quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the radio and the sounds of the city passing by. Robert's mind, however, was far from still. His father's words kept replaying in his head, and his thoughts turned to the police officers, George and Gilbert. Though the confrontation in the cafe had ended with a small victory, Robert knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There would be consequences for their actions, and he couldn't let them slide. As much as he wanted to let it go, as much as he wanted to believe that the moment had been rectified, he couldn't ignore the bigger picture. This wasn't just about his father. It was about everyone who had been wronged in similar ways. "Are you going to handle it, Robert?" Harry asked, his voice breaking through Robert's thoughts. He turned to his father, his face hardening. "Yes," he said firmly. "They need to answer for what they did. It won't be ignored. I'm going to speak with the chief tomorrow, and we'll go from there." Harry met his son's gaze for a moment, his eyes soft with the wisdom of someone who had lived through far more than Robert could imagine. "Just make sure it's not just words, son," he said quietly. "Actions matter more than anything." Robert nodded, knowing the weight behind his father's words. "I know, Dad. I won't let it be just words." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried an unspoken understanding. As they reached Robert's office building, he pulled into the parking lot and stopped the car. "I'll be back in a minute," Robert said as he got out of the car, his tone serious. Harry watched him walk into the building, his broad shoulders squared, every step purposeful. Robert wasn't just his son. He was a man of his own now, someone with the power to bring about change. As much as Harry had fought his own battles, there was a part of him that had hoped, deep down, that one day his son would be the one to make things right. Harry stayed in the car, his hands resting on his lap. He wasn't one for idle thoughts, but now, with the cool evening air drifting in through the car window, his mind wandered back to the events of the day. He couldn't shake the images of George and Gilbert. Young men, full of arrogance and pride, wielding their authority like a weapon. They didn't know him, didn't know what he had endured, what he had fought for. They had treated him as though he was invisible, as though his presence in that cafe was an affront to their sense of order. But now, as he sat alone in the car, he found some measure of peace. The fight had been hard, and the bruises were still fresh, but he had held his ground. He had stood tall, just like he always had. After a few minutes, Robert returned to the car, his expression serious but calm. "It's done," he said as he climbed into the driver's seat. "We'll have a meeting tomorrow. They'll be suspended while an internal investigation is done, and I made sure the public knows what happened." Harry nodded. the faintest trace of a smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "I didn't expect anything less from you," he said softly. Robert looked over at his father and smiled. "I'm doing this for you, Dad, and for everyone who's been treated the same way." They drove off into the night, the city lights casting long shadows along the streets. There was still a long road ahead, but Harry knew that, in his son, there was hope for a better tomorrow. The following day, after the meeting with the chief, Robert invited his father to join him for a quiet lunch. The cafe, where the incident had unfolded the day before, had reopened for business, and though the air still carried the weight of what had happened, it felt different now, more thoughtful. Harry sat at a small corner table, his back straight despite the weariness in his bones. He had agreed to come, not just because Robert had asked, but because he knew it would be good for him, good for both of them, to revisit the place, to look at it differently now. After everything, he noticed how people still glanced in their direction, though not with the same judgment they had shown the day before. There was a quiet reverence in their gazes now, an acknowledgement that something had changed in the air. People who had once looked on with indifference or disapproval now seemed to recognize him, as if the world had tilted ever so slightly to allow them to see him clearly. "Do you feel different now, Dad?" Robert asked, his voice softer than usual as he watched his father take in the room around them. Harry took a deep breath before responding, his hands folded neatly on the table. "Maybe," he said, his voice carrying a quiet resolve. "Maybe I do. But, I don't know if it's the place that's changed or me." Robert leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Harry glanced around, his gaze catching the faces of a few of the cafe's patrons. He saw a woman nodding her head at him with a respectful smile, a young man quietly sipping his coffee as he glanced up, and a couple in the corner booth who exchanged murmurs of acknowledgement. It's like they're finally seeing the man I am, not just the man they thought I was. Yesterday, all they saw was an old black man with a cane, out of place in a cafe like this. But today, they're looking at me differently. Robert nodded slowly, understanding his father's words. "It's like a shift in perspective," he said. "Like they're waking up to the fact that you belong here, that you have every right to be here, just like anyone else." "Exactly," Harry agreed, his voice steady but warm. "They didn't know me yesterday. Hell, they didn't even try to know me. They just assumed." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. The noise of the cafe swirled around them, cups clinking, low conversations murmuring, and the soft hum of the espresso machine. But the world felt different now, quieter, more reflective. There was a sense of peace in the air, but also a sense of unfinished business. "Do you think it's enough, Dad?" Robert asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I mean, we did what we had to do with George and Gilbert, but it's not just about them, Robert," Harry interrupted gently. "It's about all of us. It's not just about them being punished. It's about changing how people think, how they see us. That's what matters." Robert met his father's gaze, and in that moment, he understood the depth of what his father had been trying to tell him. It wasn't enough to just fix the small injustices. What mattered was a long-term shift in society's perception, the change in how people treated one another on a daily basis. "You're right, Dad," Robert said, a slow but confident smile spreading across his face. "It's about respect. It's about dignity. It's about showing the world that we all belong, no matter who we are or where we come from." Harry looked at his son, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. He had raised Robert to be more than just a man of authority. He had raised him to be a man of integrity, a man who understood that true strength came from understanding and empathy, not power or control. The two of them sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the cafe's lively chatter filling the space between them, but neither feeling the weight of it the same way they once had. The world outside was still full of challenges, but at that moment, the world inside felt a little bit lighter, a little bit more open. "I'm proud of you, Robert," Harry said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done more than just stand up for me. You've shown everyone that change is possible, and that's something no one can take away from us." Robert smiled back, the warmth in his expression reflecting the depth of his feelings. "I'm proud of you, too, Dad. You've taught me more than I could ever repay, and I promise we'll keep fighting for you, for everyone." They sat there, father and son, united not just by blood, but by a shared sense of purpose. As the afternoon wore on, they finished their coffee and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. But for now, there was a quiet victory in the air, one that would linger and that they would carry with them together. As they stepped out of the cafe, Harry couldn't help but glance back at the door they had just exited. The cafe was the same on the outside, its polished windows reflecting the busy street. People hurrying by with their own lives, their own stories. But to Harry, the place had shifted, transformed, as if the weight of his experiences had touched it in a way that no one could ignore. It wasn't just a cafe anymore. It had become a symbol, a place where a man could stand tall, despite the judgment, despite the assumptions. Robert walked beside him, his stride steady, his demeanor calm. But Harry could see the tension in his son's shoulders, the subtle way his jaw tightened. It wasn't over yet. The conversation with the chief, the aftermath of George and Gilbert's punishment. It was only the beginning. The road ahead was still long, full of challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Harry felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Where to next? Robert asked, breaking the silence as they walked down the street. Harry chuckled softly, the sound warm and familiar. "You know, I've been thinking about that. Maybe we take a drive out to the park. Just the two of us." Robert raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the suggestion. "A walk in the park? Really?" "Yeah," Harry said with a grin. "It's been a while since I've had a chance to just sit, you know? No more rushing. No more fighting." Robert smiled, the lines of tension in his face softening. "All right, let's do it." The two of them made their way to the park, the familiar sounds of the city fading as they approached the green space. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over everything. The park was quieter than usual, with only a few people scattered around, enjoying the evening air. Harry and Robert found a bench under a large oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a peaceful one, the kind that only comes when you're truly at ease with someone. "Sometimes I wonder, Dad," Robert began, his voice thoughtful, "if we'll ever really get to the place where it doesn't matter who we are or where we come from, where no one feels the need to judge us." Harry looked over at his son, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Maybe not," he said, his voice low but steady. "Maybe it'll never be perfect, but that doesn't mean we stop trying." Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, you're right." The sky grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, the park slowly emptying as people left for the evening. Harry felt a sense of contentment in the quiet of the moment. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. And that made all the difference. As they stood to leave, Robert's hand found his father's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. Harry looked at him, pride swelling in his chest. "Let's go home, Dad," Robert said softly. Harry smiled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, let's go home." They walked side by side through the park, each step lighter than the last. Each moment a reminder that despite the struggles they had faced, the one thing that would always remain intact was their dignity. And that was something no one, not even the world, could ever take away from them. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, they both knew they would face it together.